Excellent. Thanks, folks, for joining. We're going to be talking about Microsoft 365 security and compliance licensing. So I'm going to focus on the security and compliance features as we go through the different licensing solutions through this deck. And I'm going to start first and foremost with Office 365 A1. So Office 365 A1 is a zero-cost license for education customers, and it has the core collaboration workloads in Microsoft 365, meaning Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Office Online, etc., including Teams. As a note here, notice that Skype for Business Online, that service is going to be discontinued this year. So if you haven't moved over to Teams, definitely take that opportunity to get going there. But inside of this workload set, let's focus on what are the security and compliance specific features. So I'm going to start first and foremost with the core collaboration pieces, include basically unlimited in-place hold and litigation hold and e-discovery capability. And this is an important note. This is when these workloads are included under an Office education license, so Office 365 A1, A3, A5, any of those license suites, when they fall in the education space, unlimited in-place hold and litigation hold is included. This is an area where sometimes even our own support folks get a little hung up here and think that you need to have a higher level license to have these capabilities. But when these licenses, the core functionalities inside of an EDU license, that's not the case. Likewise, data loss prevention, so applying DLP rules to emails and files in Exchange Online, files in any of the SharePoint Online workloads, whether it's SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, as well as messages and files in Yammer. So DLP is included in the core functionality as well. Also part of the core functionality is Exchange Online protection. So in every version of Exchange Online, every license includes EOP, Exchange Online protection. And this provides not only connection filtering, so whitelist, blacklist, even graylist filtering there. It provides malware protection. So there are 3 different anti-malware engines built into the service. That includes one of ours and 2 third-party engines. And provides the core anti-malware service as part of Exchange Online, as well as spam filtering. So all of that is included in all of the Exchange Online licenses, regardless of whether it's A1, A3, A5, or the Exchange Online for Alumni license as well. And then part of this included in the A1 license is Azure Active Directory Basic. That's going to provide multi-factor authentication in a non-conditional state. We're going to talk about the capabilities of Azure AD Premium in a second. And self-service password reset for cloud-only accounts. So some of the areas where we see this being used in education is specifically for alumni licenses. So we have a lot of customers that are moving alumni into a specific domain or even into a specific tenant in some cases, and then moving those accounts to what's called cloud-only accounts. And so as part of that, you can provide self-service password reset to the user. You can provide multi-factor authentication in those types of scenarios. Now for AD integrated accounts where you're synchronizing identity from Active Directory, you're going to want to use Azure AD Premium for those, which we'll talk about next as part of A3 and A5. But this is the core functionality built into A1. Now, next up, we'll talk about Microsoft 365 A3 and A5. There's a ton of features across the board here, and the majority of our education customers have moved to the Microsoft 365 program, whether it's A3 or A5. Originally, these licenses landed as separate components, which is why they're depicted this way on the screen. So Office 365, the Windows license, the EMS suite, Minecraft, etc. But if you've been in the program for some time, you may have these land as components. If you're new to the program or you've gone through an anniversary or a renewal, you may have been moved to what's called the unified license. So the Microsoft 365 A3 and A5 license, all as one license with the service plans within it. And that's fine. Functionality is really the same across the board. It really comes down to how it's packaged and delivered from a license perspective. But we're going to dive in further to talk about the specific security and compliance features of each one of these. I'll start with A3. And specifically in Office 365 A3, you have Office 365 Cloud App Security, or sometimes referred to as OCAS, right? This is our Cloud App Security broker limited to just Office 365 workloads. So this is going to give you a number of different capabilities, mainly threat detection inside of Office 365 apps. So the ability to look at what users are doing within these applications and take action or alert based on certain activities. You can put in rules to detect threshold events, such as mass downloads of files out of OneDrive or out of SharePoint, so-called impassable travel scenarios, sequences of events occurring, and either be alerted or take action based on those behaviors. You can also control application access to Office 365 apps conditionally. But again, this is our cloud app security broker limited to just Office 365 apps, as opposed to the full Microsoft Cloud App Security, which can be leveraged for other cloud applications as part of A5. In the Windows 10 license, you have access to Windows 10 Enterprise or Education Edition, both of which have enterprise features, such as the ability to do things like obviously join the device to a domain, whether it's Azure AD or Active Directory, the ability to enable features such as App Blocker to control access to what applications are being run on those devices, or things like Credential Guard to be able to protect against threats against identities such as pass the hash or pass the ticket type of attacks against credentials. So you get the Enterprise or Education Edition of Windows 10 as part of A3 as well. The bulk of the capabilities, I think, from a security perspective, really fall in the EMS suite. So we'll start with Azure AD Premium. Again, this is our directory service underneath our cloud applications, can provide things like single sign-on for cloud applications. Really, any OAuth SAML compliant application can leverage Azure AD as its authentication and authorization engine. On top of that, you can provide conditional access with multi-factor authentication to access for the access to those applications. So, for example, with multi-factor, we support mobile device, our authenticator application, text message based, voice phone call, and unlike some other solutions, there's no usage costs associated with this. So you can do multi-factor in any one of those modalities without paying additional costs, all part of Azure AD Premium. You also get self-service password reset, but in this case, you also have the ability to write that back to AD. So as the user changes their password, maybe they've forgotten their password or they want to just do it from a cloud access perspective, that password gets committed back to on-premise AD and with Azure AD Premium as well. We also provide an access proxy for legacy web applications. So you can make legacy apps look, act, and feel like cloud applications. And more importantly, provide the same conditional access with optional multi-factor to provide access to those legacy cloud apps. Again, strengthening your identity position and really pulling all authentication back to a single directory. Also part of EMS is Azure Information Protection P1. This provides manual data classification and protection, so the ability to create data classifications for your organization and have users apply those classifications either in documents such as Office or in email, right? The ability to mark something as being sensitive, maybe it's HIPAA related, those types of things, and then optionally put protections in place on top of it. So the ability to encrypt that content so that it is safe and secure no matter where it is stored. And again, that's typically applied either to Office documents or in email. We'll talk a little bit more in some of the other licenses about auto classification capabilities as well. Next up, we have Intune. So this provides core mobile device management, as you would think of it in the constitution of, let's say, iOS or Android devices, being able to do device policy enforcement, mandate security on that device, whether it's a PIN on the device, encrypted storage, things of that nature. It's also increasingly become the device or the platform of choice for managing Windows devices and moving away from the traditional imaging of devices, joining it to Active Directory, managing it with a traditional software deployment tool such as SCCM, but rather moving towards the ability to support mobile devices, Azure AD joined Windows devices and manage those with Intune. Really a great vehicle for supporting devices anywhere. I'm a 15-year employee at the company. My second day on the job was working from home, so I've watched the evolution of what it takes to manage Windows devices to remote employees, and certainly COVID-19 has really brought that to the forefront and folks that are doing this with Intune are really in an advantageous state for managing mobile devices. So let's shift gears over to A5 and talk about some of the enhancements in the security compliance licensing over on the A5 side. So first, in the Office 365 side, we have Defender for Office 365. This is really our tool for battling the attacks against users that typically come through email. So this is where our safe attachments and safe links functionality provides those protections. Things like detonating attachments to look at their behavior, rewriting URLs to protect users when they click on those links. We also added anti-phishing capability about 9 to 12 months ago inside of Defender for Office 365. For those who may not have picked up on our licensing name changes, this used to be called Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection or Office 365 ATP. Now it falls under the Defender naming convention, so it's called Defender for Office 365. We also added attack simulation training as well, so to be able to do things like issue phishing attacks against your users, measure that response, and educate them on the importance of being careful when being faced with links in email and being attacked through that mechanism. Moving on to the endpoint, this used to be called Defender ATV or Defender Advanced Threat Protection, now is called Defender for Endpoint. And again, this provides our endpoint detection and response, our EDR capability, as well as traditional antivirus or endpoint protection. This is a cross-platform solution, so it supports Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, and iOS. And again, everything I've been talking about so far is licensed per user. So when you apply an A5 license to a user, they get this capability, right? But what that means is that your user is covered for all the devices that they're working on. So if they have a laptop, if they have a tablet, if they have a mobile device, and you need to protect all of those devices, you're covered. And this is why we license based on user rather than device in the typical scenarios. From a server perspective, however, Defender for Endpoint is also available separately to license on servers, but it is not part of the Microsoft 365 A3 or A5 licensing. In EMS, we enhance a number of the capabilities that were provided in the A3 license that are noted here. So first and foremost, in Azure Active Directory Premium P2, this is where we add privileged identity management, the ability to do identity escalation. So when a user moves from an account of low privilege to a higher level of privilege, being able to gate access to that higher level of privilege. Let's say you're going to enforce multi-factor in that scenario, and then also time bound them. So they can be granted that higher level of privilege for a specific period of time and then move back to a lower privileged access once that time has expired. This also adds the identity protection capability to Azure AD. So this is where we do vulnerable and risky account detection. So things like detecting if credential pairs have been found in the wild, and when you have a matched credential set, now that user represents a riskier account or a riskier access, and you can change their conditional access parameters and whether or not they can access certain applications under those guidelines. Information protection, Azure Information Protection, this should actually say P2. I've got a typo there, I've got to fix. But this enhances the Azure Information Protection that's included in A3 to provide automatic data classification and protection. So now, rather than relying on the user to make the right choice in how they're classifying this information, you can put rules in place, much like you would for data loss prevention, to identify certain sensitive information types and either auto-classify or suggest classification as the user is creating them. So for example, within Microsoft, I know sometimes when we're creating documents or PowerPoints, we'll get a suggestion that suggests that we should mark the document as confidential based on what information type we've hit upon in that information that we're creating. You also have the ability to go out and apply those rules retroactively to existing files that may exist in file shares, SharePoint sites, OneDrive, and the like. Next, we have Defender for Identity. This is protecting user identities and credentials in Active Directory. So this is where, by simply adding an agent to your domain controller, we're looking for attacks against identity. There are about 30 or so known attacks, I think, at last check. and we can alert based on those attacks that we've seen. This has really been a valuable tool in stopping attacks from moving laterally to accounts of higher value. So you may have an account that becomes compromised due to ransomware or some other type of attack. The worst thing that can happen is that that attacker then gets inside your environment, then uses mechanisms to move laterally to account of higher value. Worst case scenario, domain compromise. Then you're in a really bad situation to recover from that type of attack. So very simple solution to implement and put some protections against that sort of activity. And then lastly, Microsoft Cloud App Security. Again, this is referred to as MCAS. This is our full Cloud App Security broker, right? So this is where we're looking at threat detection and conditional access app control for cloud applications, not only within the Office 365 set, but third-party cloud applications as well. And there's some other enhancements in this tool as well. I've included at the end of this deck a link to all of these solutions where you can do deeper comparisons across the board as well. Okay, now I separated the compliance features out into a separate slide because we've been making a huge amount of investments in this area around compliance in A5. So really, these features all align against 3 different individual licenses: the information protection and governance, insider risk management, and e-discovery and audit. And you'll see some overlap here, right? And the reason for that is it is possible for customers to license any of these solutions a la carte. And so as part of that a la carte licensing, if you were just to license information protection and governance and not the full A5 suite, for example, you would get Microsoft Cloud App Security through that individual license as well. Likewise, obviously, you get it as part of the full suite. Now, some of the things I'll call out here, I won't go through all of these in great detail because it would take quite a bit of time, but I'll call out a couple of the ones that we've seen interested education specifically. Obviously, communications DLP, or the ability to put DLP rule sets against Teams chats, that's one. I talked about rules-based auto classification as part of Azure Information Protection, and also the upcoming machine learning-based auto classification. Again, both of those trying to make it easier to provide data classification and automate the process of data labeling and protecting content within the environment. We also have, let's see, jumping down, insider risk management. Information barriers is another one that customers are looking at, being able to put barriers in between different constituents of users to block communications between those users. That may be, for example, between a student and a superintendent of a school district, or president of a university, things of that nature. Information barriers is a hard block, right? So it's going to stop them from being able to communicate as via Teams, for example, or see presence, things of that nature. Another one I'll call out down the bottom, advanced audit as part of the e-discovery and audit. This has been popular in our academic medical center environments because it provides a 1-year audit record of everything the user does inside of online services, down to access in their own mailbox, for example. This has been very useful in scenarios of forensic discovery. So let's say you have an account that's been compromised and you need to be able to determine what did that attacker access in the time period in which that account was compromised. Advanced Audit's going to give you that capability. And then likewise on the advanced e-discovery, this is basically a solution that we acquired this many years ago. It's was kind of the leading tool in the analytics e-discovery space, and really it's a tool to provide post-processing against e-discovered data and being able to reduce the amount of time and effort it takes to go through e-discovered content by doing things like threading conversations, removing duplicates, and applying analytics to the data that's e-discovered to determine its relevance or non-relevance. So that's been a useful solution, especially in litigation-based scenarios. Okay, so A3 versus A5, those are 2 of the main options for Microsoft 365, but there's also some solutions in between that I want to cover briefly. After we launched the Microsoft 365 program, we had a lot of customers that said, hey, I'm interested in the features of A5 from a security perspective, but I'm not necessarily ready for everything else that's in that suite. So we launched A5 Security as an add-on to A3. And just like it sounds, we basically pulled out the security functionality of A5 and put that into an add-on at a lower cost. And the cost, again, fits in between that A3 and A5 license set. Likewise, we created one for the compliance features as well, and we pulled that out into something called A5 compliance and offer that separately in between A3 and A5. Now, you wouldn't license both A5 security and A5 compliance. If you were to do that, you'd be paying more than full A5 at that point. But if you're interested, we've had some customers that again just wanted the security features, so they would do the add-on to A3. I think most customers that are interested in the compliance features are also interested in security, so they tend to lean towards the full A5. But I want to make sure that everybody was aware of those options as well. And then lastly, let's talk about student use benefits. So when you license under the Education License Program, the EES, when you license Microsoft 365, either A3 or A5, you also have a student use benefit license that comes at no charge at a 40-to-1 ratio. So let's say you license 1,000 faculty and staff, you can get up to 40,000 student licenses at no cost. But what's in the student use benefit license does not include everything that is in the paid license. Now, we work pretty hard to work with our product groups to make sure that we can add as much into that student use benefit license as possible. But you'll look on this chart, you'll see that it aligns most closely with the identity and security features. We want to make sure that students who are typically participants in the same environment as faculty and staff, that their accounts are protected, that their infrastructure is protected, just like faculty and staff are. So you'll see a lot of the features aligning most closely with identity and security. It's not every feature, but like I said, it's the majority of it. So this chart kind of shows you which features of the A3, A5 security, and A5 licenses have student use benefits associated with them as part of the license as well. And that's really it. This is the slide I promised earlier. We'll make sure that this deck is available to everybody. My customers have found this probably the most valuable because each one of these are hyperlinks that bring you to information, typically a comparison of the features between the different license sets. For example, in Azure AD, comparing P1 and P2, because these things change often. We're always adding more capabilities, and it's best to reference the actual product website to determine the most recent information. And Steve, do you want to talk to the upcoming events?
We can talk about it in a few minutes. I do want to answer some questions while everybody's running through a bunch of these licensing questions.
Yeah,
you
go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see Stephen Kroc, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So we've kind of micro-segmented our management. Oh, hello. Check.
That's right. I got Jason. I muted him.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Okay, sorry. We've kind of micro-segmented our accounts where we have a user account, and that user is also a management or like an operating systems analyst. So we've given him a management account. And then we use PIM to escalate, but we also have our break glass kind of owner accounts that are heavily audited. We have separate domain admin accounts, all based on the user's identity. So that one user ends up having like 5 heavily audited accounts. If I wanted those all to have the greatest security on them, would I need 5 of these licenses?
So not necessarily. It depends on the functionality that you're requiring. Now, with that said, every user needs a license, right? So if you have separate user accounts, there's no way around requiring a license for that user. But it also depends on the functionality that they require. So I'll give you an example. Under the Microsoft 365 licensing, you may have heard that the model talks about education qualified users and light workers. With the idea being that not every user needs all the functionality required. And so we have this concept of a light worker might get an A1 license. That may be somebody whose day-to-day job doesn't require them to have access to all the functionality of Microsoft 365. So the free A1 license is enough to be able to, give them an email account, be able to communicate with them and so forth. With that said, oftentimes customers will license some of the security and identity features for that A1 account. One common example is Azure AD Premium, right? Typically, you want every user in your environment to have the same capabilities from an identity perspective when it comes to multi-factor authentication, conditional access, and so forth. Or Defender for Office 365 would be another, light item that you might license for a light worker because you want to protect their email account from attacks via, phishing and zero-day attacks and those types of things. So the reason why, kind of roundabout way of answering your question, is you can license the user for the core functionality that they require, and that may not mean you need to step them up to a full A5, for example, across all of those accounts. I would look very closely at what functionality each one of those accounts requires for what they're doing, and be able to pare those down. And the nice thing about it is with group-based licensing, it makes it easier to be able to put different users in different categories and be able to assign just the functionality that they need, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
All right, we do have other questions there, and I think there was one that somebody had mentioned about Defender for Identities not having student use benefit. There is a student use benefit for Defender for Identities, but it is just in the A5 All Up suite, correct?
Correct. Yes, Defender for Identity does have student use benefit in full A5. It doesn't have one in A5 Security, and it obviously doesn't have one in A3 because that's not an included solution. And I should have mentioned also, I mentioned a la carte licensing. Many of the solutions that have student use benefits, when you license them a la carte, they also have a student use benefit. So to that example, Defender for Office 365 is an excellent example of that. We have many customers that have added that on top of A3. And when you do that, you do get the student use benefit associated with it also.
Sorry about that. The mailman's here and working from home. Well, the dogs love with the mailman, right? So and that went to Sean Adams' question. So yes, when you purchase A5 All Up, you will get student use benefit for Defender for Identity. So yes, you can install that on all your domain controllers, on your ADFS service if you have those. There is actually no way to segment the users inside of on a domain controller that we're going to be protecting. So if you plan on using Defender for Identities, yes, it would have to cover all of them, whether it be with student use benefits or licenses on the side.
Yep. This is a great question. I'm reading in the IM window about their perspective of ramping to implement all of the A5, focusing on the security tools. Is there an order of action that's recommended that addresses product dependencies? Yeah, that's a great question. So I often get that question is, how do I get started? We've moved to A5. Okay, what do I deploy first? That sort of thing. And it really depends on a number of different factors. I would say first and foremost, if you're displacing an existing solution, a lot of that has to do with timing of that existing solution, right? How much time do you have to move away from that existing solution before that contract requires a renewal or things of that nature? There are also some tools that are much easier to deploy than others because there isn't an end user component to it. A good example of that is Defender for Identity, right? You deploy that on the back end, the user doesn't even know it exists. It doesn't affect their life, their day-to-day life in any way, shape, or form. It's just a tool that you put on your domain controllers, and then you start to realize value from that. So, that's an example of a relatively low-hanging fruit tool to implement, with no user impact, no training required, things of that nature.
And one thing I want to add about that real quick is, if you, hopefully nobody here has to ever engage our DART team, because that means that, you've been breached for the most part, but that is the first thing that they actually install when they're engaged, because there is low impact to the end user and it is relatively easy to deploy.
Yep, absolutely. I wouldn't say that there are really any dependencies across the board as I look through the security tools in the A5 suite. But there are enhancements that occur as you get more of them implemented. So, a great example of that would be our zero trust methodology and conditional access, right? You can implement conditional access, multi-factor authentication, looking at different conditions like where is the user connecting from, is the user on a managed device or not. But when you layer in things like Defender for Endpoint, now you can enhance that further to say, okay, now we can look at, is that device healthy or not? And that may change the conditions that we determine as to whether or not the user can access the application, right? If it's a very sensitive application, sensitive data, those types of things. So a lot of times these tools will enhance each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't implement zero trust and conditional access until you implement Defender for Office 365. It just kind of gives you, it gives you a little bit, more enhancement when you get there. So there's a lot of those types of things that occur. There's a question here. What is the name of the low-hanging fruit that gets installed on servers? That was Defender for identity. Sorry.
And I guess the next low-hanging fruit that I would probably tend to target would be either Office Cloud App Security or Microsoft Cloud App Security, especially around the Office suite, because when you enable the CASB product, it's in an audit or a notification only mode until you actually change those policies to start taking action. So I think between Defender for Identities and Office Cloud App Security and or Microsoft Cloud App Security, depending on what you're licensed for, I think those are two really good places to start. Megan does have her hand up. So Megan, if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. We did go with the full A5 license, and we've had it for about a year now. It's been great. But one of the things I noticed is I'm seeing a Microsoft Defender for Endpoint license in the tenant. That's the same number of the A5 licenses, and I wasn't sure what that applies to. And I'm asking because we're actually planning on rolling out the EDNR tools next week.
Great question. So yeah, since you have it A5, you do have Defender for Endpoint. I've seen certain instances as we've gone through the iterations of the Microsoft 365 licensing. I mentioned earlier the concept of the original license versus the unified license. In other words, originally all the components of M365 A5 would land as separate pieces. So you'd have Office 365 license, you'd have a Windows license, you'd have an EMS license, and so forth. And then as you move to the unified SKU, all of it rolls up under one license with different service plans within it. So it's possible. I've seen instances where Defender for Endpoint shows up separately, but ordinarily it should be bundled within that Office or that Microsoft 365 A5 license, unless of course it was purchased separately for servers as a line item.
So it doesn't need to be applied to anything. It's just sort of there as legacy.
Correct. Right.
And that might change over time, but if it does change over time, by the time that happens, you'll be on the unified SKU where that user will have a total A5 license to begin with.
Correct. Yeah, there's also, for those not on the unified SKU, there's another license that you may see show up in your tenant. And I think it was something like A5 services, Microsoft 365 A5 suite services. And that was a license that was added to people that had the original SKU because there were some capabilities that were not getting enabled because it looked like the customer didn't license Microsoft 365. It looks like you licensed the components when really you didn't. You licensed the suite. It just landed as the components. So those of you who are still on the original license may see that in your tenant as well. Nothing to be alarmed or concerned about. And as Steve mentioned, at your next anniversary, we're trying to move everybody to the unified license because it makes it simpler and it reduces the confusion.
Let's see. So Paige has a question. If we have a user that is assigned an A5 license, what happens to their MFA, SSPR, using conditional access if they go down to A3 or A1? So that's a really good question. Nothing's going to happen to the registration. So even in A1, there's MFA, and we've combined our MFA self-service password registration page together. So even if you move down to A1, they're still registered. You can't use conditional access to apply the policy to them. And even with A3, the conditional access is still part of A3. You just won't be able to use the identity protection pieces on that user, but nothing should happen to the registration.
Right, and it's important to note too, conditional access is part of both Azure AD Premium P1 and P2, so both A3 and A5. It's just not in the A1 license. Some questions about where can we deploy and install Defender for Endpoint? Okay, yeah, Steve, you answered that question, I think.
Yeah, and then there was, okay, what about, so there's another question here. What about endpoints that are not assigned to a particular user? Again, another great question. If all the users that are going to use that, let's say, shared resource are licensed for A5 or Defender for Endpoint, then you can apply the license there. If it's going to be students or somebody that's not covered by the license, then you either have to license the users and or license the device, and there is a device-based SKU that you can use. Next, can or cannot MFA be enforced on A1 users? Yes, they can, but you have to use the default policies. So in other words, it's turned on for them for that app. There's no conditions that can be met other than the fact that they're on your internal network or not. So you can't use any of the, where's the user coming from, what device they're coming from. You can't limit their access. It's either on or off. They either do MFA and they have access, or they don't do MFA and they don't have access. So, but yes, they do get MFA. And is it just the app, or are we still doing SMS and telephonic? Do you know, Mike?
We're still doing SMS and phone, as far as I know, because I have a personal tenant that doesn't have Azure AD Premium.
Okay.
And to that note, the only exclusion you can do is you can exclude it for certain networks, but you can't do full conditional.
The app for OTP, I believe, is supported, just not push notifications or passwordless.
Okay.
And it does have to be, so if you have conditional access, so if you have an Azure AD tenant with A3 and A1 users, you can't use the default baselines with conditional access being active. So you'd have to default to the per user enforcement in the other Azure MFA portal.
And we recommend that you use the app anyway, because it's more secure than SMS or telephone. Do you see any other questions on here around licensing?
Yeah, there's some functionality around or questions around Defender and WVD. How does Defender for Endpoint work in WVD? Do WVD servers need to be licensed separately, or does it use one of the 5 device licenses for users? I mean, the clients inside of WVD would be covered because the users are covered. So.
Yeah, I think so. This has been a while. I'll jump in there. We've been tracking that because, and forgive me for not remembering where we are today. I know that, so Defender for Endpoint in Windows Virtual Desktop, you can present a session host that's running a client operating system or a server operating system. Generally in EDU, there's huge uptake in the client operating system because with Windows 10 Enterprise for virtual desktops, you've got a thing that quacks like a server, walks like a server, scales like a server. Why would I use a server and have to buy ODS CALs when I own M365, A3, or A5 for my users, and I can deliver client OS VDI as well as remote apps and one-to-many. I do believe where we are right now as far as GA support is, if I'm not mistaken, the Defender for Endpoint on Windows 10 is a one-to-one, not the one-to-many scenario yet, or it has a low scale limit. I just can't remember what the number is. So that's a space to watch. We talk about it on Azure all the time, and I'm sure we'll talk about it tomorrow on the call.
Hey, Emmanuel. Yeah, I'm pasting the link here in the chat window. Defender for Endpoint integration, just became generally available, so it does support up to 50 concurrent user
50.
connections.
That's
Yeah.
the number. Awesome. Yeah, so it got high. That's
Yeah,
good.
it was just announced, so I'm pasting the link right there in the chat window.
Great question. Late breaking. Good.
So Scott's got a question in the IM window. What features are included in Office 365 A5 for faculty are not included in EMS E5? It's important to distinguish between Office 365 A5 and Microsoft 365 A5. And that's why I like to depict it like how we have it shown here on the screen. This is still the logical licensing difference, right? Microsoft 365 is a bundle of everything that's down below. So if you're licensed for just Office 365 A5, you would get things like Defender for Office 365, but you wouldn't have Defender for Endpoint because you don't have the full Microsoft 365 A5. So I know it can be confusing, but and again, if you paid for Microsoft 365 A5, but in your tenant you may see these as separate components, all of these as separate components. That just means you're on the original license and it's not all wrapped up into one package, but it will be most likely at your next anniversary. If that makes sense.
Yep, thank you.
Let's see. Question around licensing. So we have A1 users, alumni who are assigned conditional access policy to block legacy auth and use the Duo integration. It seems to be working. Is this not supposed to be working? No, I would say it's not supposed to be working because I believe the Duo integration requires Azure AD Premium, but correct me if I'm wrong, Steve.
It does, but do you have an alumni tenant that's separate from your faculty, staff, and students that have the premium license?
He put a second post down below, and he said he's got A5s in the tenant, but they're not
Oh,
he's alumni.
yeah, that's why.
Yeah. Yeah. So you'll run into many scenarios where we don't require a license assignment. It's a bit on the honor system, so the licenses being in the tenant will light up the feature, but you're technically not licensed properly in that scenario. Yeah.
But there's really nothing either I or you or anybody from Microsoft or the customer can do about it unless you wanted to go in and split those people off and take them out of a conditional access policy. And at the end of the day, again, not trying to sell you anything from a Duo versus Microsoft perspective, but Azure MFA is included, especially when it comes to the alumni side. You can actually have a conditional access policy that just calls Azure MFA and not Duo MFA. So we start to see sometimes when people move out of being a registered student and moving into the alumni that they move to Azure MFA just because they don't have to worry about incurring any additional costs from the Duo side of the house.
Yep. Now, with that said, I've had some customers that needed Azure AD Premium for alumni because they had other identity needs beyond just Office 365, right? Other workloads that require them to keep their Active Directory account active, and really they're almost full-blown users just with obviously less applications. And unfortunately, we don't have standard alumni licensing, but our license desk has worked with us. So if you do need that, we can work with your account manager and the license desk to come up with an approach for alumni. Sorry, Nick, you were going to say something. I think I cut you off.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say that the link I posted earlier in the chat is really good for cases like this. I have A1, but I have A5, so some things are lit up. It will basically break out our features from a security compliance perspective and give you some insights as to, we understand that this is lit up for everybody. However, if we give you the ability to scope it, please scope it, like Steve mentioned, honor system, and so on and so forth. It's a really good kind of just checks and balances, if you will, if you just want to make sure that you're falling in line with where you're properly licensed on the user front.
Yep, excellent point.
All right. Okay, cool.
Any other questions?
If not, I am going to stop the. Well, okay, I can leave this part on the recording. So normally we turn the recording off after the icebreaker session, if you will, but because there was such spirited conversation and questions flying back and forth around the licensing side, I thought it would be a good idea to have everybody else be able to listen to those, so it might answer their questions as well. So I kept it running. There is some up and coming security training events. So Dave, you're the one that asked me to present these. One of the things that I had seen on the registration page, it says for U.S. education customers only. We do have customers from Canada and a couple of customers from around the world that are part of our security office hours. Are you going to turn them away if they register as long as they're education?
Actually, this came up. Yeah, as of right now, yeah, there's not going to be anything that's going to be turning them away.
Okay.
So I would say if you're an education customer, feel free to register. In the future, yeah, since the sessions may be limited, right? We may request, right, that you're
Sure.
at least an U.S. education customer, but for now, there's nothing preventing folks from registering.
Do you have any other than what it says in the PowerPoint here? Is there anything you wanted to mention about these classes?
No, there's a lot of interest in the Azure security technologies. Folks that want to take the AZ500 CERT exam, certification exam. That's a good one. A lot of discussions around Sentinel and leveraging these connectors. So I was really interested, Michael, when you were going over the A3 versus A5, right? Like A3 customers that have cloud app security, they'll be able to leverage that free connector into Sentinel. They'll also information protection, right? Azure information protection that's covered with A3. That's also a free connector. So these sessions around using that cloud native SIEM to ingest those security alerts into Sentinel, I think those would be highly of interest, right, for folks that want to learn how to connect those services into Azure Sentinel. So, and then also the CUSTA query language, right? If you're using Azure Security Center, using Azure Monitor, there's a lot of interest in learning how to use the basics, right, of the CUSTA query language. So these are three Sentinel sessions. I encourage folks to sign up and take advantage of them.
All right.
Excellent.
And like I said, the recording will be available after the call, and of course we'll make the deck available as well. So all the links that are in here, everybody should be able to get to once the deck is made available. And we'll also post these inside the Teams channel as well. So what I'm going to do right now is stop recording.